They once lived in a quiet town where life moved at a slow pace. The family was ordinary in many ways, hard-working, kind to neighbors, and proud of the little they owned. Their small home stood at the edge of a narrow street where children played and elders gathered in the evenings. For years they believed they belonged there, but belonging is fragile. At first it was just whispers. A few neighbors began to question their choices, their way of living, the way they kept to themselves sometimes. Rumors spread like dry leaves catching fire. No one knew exactly who started them, but the gossip grew stronger, passed from one doorway to another, repeated in shops, and carried by voices that smiled in public but judged in private. The family tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was nothing, that people always talked. Yet slowly things began to change. Friends who once shared tea with them stopped visiting. Invitations to gatherings stopped coming. Even in the marketplace, where faces once greeted them warmly, people now avoided eye contact. It wasn't one big event that broke them. It was the small, everyday cuts. A neighbor refusing to accept their greeting. Children in the street whispering behind their backs. Doors shutting a little too quickly when they walked by. The family kept asking themselves, what did we do wrong? They searched their memories for mistakes, for reasons people would turn against them, but they found none that could explain such coldness. Their hearts grew heavier each day, carrying questions without answers. Soon the gossip hardened into rejection. People began to say they were not fit to be part of the community. Some even suggested they should leave, that their presence was a stain on the neighborhood's name. It was cruel, yet it was said with the certainty of those who believed they were protecting something valuable. The family tried to hold on. They kept their heads down, worked harder, and hoped things would change. But the more they tried to prove themselves, the more the community pushed them away. One day, the turning point came. At a local meeting, when issues of the town were being discussed, someone openly stood and pointed at them, declaring that their kind was not wanted there. It wasn't a violent outburst, but it was public and final. No one defended them. No one spoke up in their favor. The silence of the crowd was louder than the accusation itself. That night, the family sat together in their small home. The air was thick with sorrow. They realized they could no longer fight what was bigger than them. Their world, the town they had called home for generations, had closed its doors. Leaving was not simple. Their roots were deep. Every corner of the town held a memory. The streets where their children first walked, the small garden where they had planted flowers, the festivals they once celebrated shoulder to shoulder with neighbors. To walk away felt like tearing out a piece of themselves, but sometimes holding on hurts more than letting go. With heavy hearts, they decided to leave. They packed what little they could carry, some clothes, a few tools, a handful of old photographs, and a box of letters that held the history of their family. They left behind their furniture, their garden, and the walls that once sheltered their laughter. On the morning of their departure, no one came to see them off. The street was quiet, almost indifferent, as if the town had already erased them from its memory. They loaded their belongings onto a small cart and began walking toward the road that led away from everything they knew. Each step was painful. The children looked back again and again, watching their home grow smaller in the distance. The elders walked with slow determination, their faces lined not only with age but with sorrow, and in their silence was a truth. They were not leaving by choice, they were being pushed away. As they crossed the boundary of the town, the family felt both broken and strangely free. Broken because the life they built had been taken from them. Free because they no longer had to beg for acceptance from those who had turned cold. The road ahead was uncertain. They did not know where they would find shelter, or whether any place in the world would accept them. But one thing was clear. The town that once felt like home had closed its heart, and they could never return. That day, the family became wanderers. Their story of exile had begun, and though they did not yet realize it, this painful journey would lead them to a place where the earth itself would open its arms. When they left the town behind, the family thought the hardest part was over. They believed that once they stepped away from the people who had turned against them, life would slowly become easier. But what waited for them on the road was a different kind of struggle, one that tested their bodies, their minds, and their hope. At first, the family tried to settle in a nearby village. They rented a small room, and the elders offered to work for anyone who would hire them. They were skilled with their hands. They could repair things, take care of land, and do hard labor without complaint. For a short time, it looked like they might rebuild their lives. But whispers followed them. The past traveled faster than they did. Within weeks, neighbors began to question who they were and why they had left their old home. Rumors grew, as they always do. Soon, the faces in that village looked the same as the ones they had left behind, curious at first, then suspicious, and finally cold. So once again, they packed their bags and moved on. This became their pattern. They went from one town to another, trying to find a place where they could live without being judged. But every time, history repeated itself. Someone would learn they had been forced to leave their home, and that fact alone was enough to paint them as outcasts. No one wanted to hear their side of the story. No one wanted to know the truth. The children began to notice the way people stared at them. The older ones learned not to ask too many questions, not to expect kindness from strangers. They learned how to carry silence, because even speaking could invite more judgment. The parents tried to shield them, but children are sharp. They can feel when the world does not want them. Food became harder to find. Some days they survived only on bread and water. They sold small belongings one by one, an old watch, a warm blanket, even the few books they had carried from their home. Each sale bought them a few more days of survival, but took away a piece of comfort. Slowly, the family's life shrank down to only the essentials, staying together and moving forward. Nights were the hardest. When they found no room to stay, they slept under open skies. The ground became their bed, and the stars their ceiling. At first, the children found it exciting, like an adventure. But after weeks of cold nights, it stopped feeling magical. They missed the safety of walls, the warmth of a fire, the sound of familiar neighbors in the distance. Instead, the darkness around them was silent and uncertain. The parents kept their spirits strong for the sake of the young ones. They told stories around small fires, stories of the times when life was good, when festivals filled the air with music, and when kindness was more common. They spoke of hope, of a future where they would find a place to belong. But inside they worried. They had no clear path, no home waiting for them. Each day felt like a step into fog. The family tried to take small jobs wherever they could. Sometimes they worked in fields, collecting harvests under the hot sun. Other times they cleaned, built, or carried heavy loads for coins. The work was tiring, but it gave them enough to eat. Yet the payment was always temporary, the acceptance always thin. As soon as the jobs ended, so did people's tolerance for them. They were once again seen as outsiders, not neighbors. Seasons changed. Summer passed into autumn, and then winter arrived. The cold became another enemy. Without steady shelter, the family suffered through freezing winds. They wrapped themselves in whatever they had left, huddling together at night to share warmth. Their hands grew rough, their faces tired. But still, they walked forward. There were moments of kindness, though rare. A stranger once offered them a warm meal when he saw them sitting by the roadside. An old woman gave the children a few apples from her basket. A farmer let them sleep in his barn for a night when the weather was too harsh. These small acts lit sparks in their hearts. The family held on to those sparks, even when everything else felt dark. But the rejection hurt more than the hunger or the cold. No matter how much they worked, no matter how quietly they lived, the same wall always appeared between them and the rest of the world. People saw them as less, simply because they were wanderers, because they had been cast out once before. It was as if the mark of rejection followed them everywhere. The children began to ask questions that broke the parents' hearts. Why doesn't anyone want us? Are we bad people? Did we do something wrong? The parents had no clear answers. They only said, "We are not bad." The world sometimes closes its doors to those it does not understand. One day, we will find a door that opens. Days turned into months. The road became their constant companion. They grew used to carrying their lives on their backs, to eating whatever they could find, to moving before anyone could push them away again. They became shadows, slipping from place to place, never staying long enough to be rooted. Yet in all this wandering, the family discovered something about themselves. They realized they could survive on very little. They realized that as long as they stayed together, they could keep walking no matter how heavy the journey felt. Their strength did not come from being accepted by others, but from holding on to each other. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at them. How long could they live like this? How many times could they start over, only to be rejected again? The parents worried about the children's future. What kind of life would they have if no place in the world opened its arms to them? One evening, as the family sat by a small fire on the edge of yet another town, the father looked at the sky and whispered, "Maybe the earth itself is our only home. These towns, these walls, these people, they all turn us away. But the ground beneath us, the air around us, the food from the soil, these have never rejected us." The words stayed with them. The road was unkind, but the earth never refused them a place to rest. The soil did not ask for their history. The sky did not judge them. It gave them space even when people did not. And without realizing it, this thought was the seed of what was to come. For now, though, they remained wanderers. Each sunrise meant another walk, another search, another attempt at survival. But even in their endless wandering, hope flickered faintly within them. They did not know when or how, but they believed that somewhere there had to be a place where they could stop running, where the world would finally allow them to belong. The road had tested them for months, maybe even years. It was hard to count anymore. Each sunrise felt the same. Waking up with tired bodies, searching for food, moving their feet without knowing where they would stop. Their journey had stretched so long that the idea of home felt like a memory from another lifetime. They had endured hunger, cold, and rejection. But what came next was heavier than all of that. It was the weight of despair. At first, they had strength because hope carried them. Every new place felt like it might be the one. Every time they entered a town or village, they told themselves, "Maybe this time people will see us differently. Maybe this time we will be accepted." That hope pushed them forward when their legs wanted to give up. But as one door after another closed, their faith in the future began to break. The family had reached a point where even strangers could see their exhaustion. Their clothes were worn thin, their shoes torn. Their faces told the story of long nights and harder days. The parents tried to keep smiles alive for the children, but the effort showed in their eyes. They were running out of strength to pretend everything would be fine. One evening, they reached a small town at the edge of the hills. They had barely eaten for 2 days. Their last coins had gone to buy a little bread, which they had divided carefully so that each child could have at least a bite. The parents themselves ate nothing. They were too used to sacrifice by then. They asked around quietly if anyone could give them work, any kind, even the hardest tasks. But most people shook their heads, some without even listening. Others looked at them with suspicion, as if poverty itself was a crime. By nightfall, no one had offered them a chance. They found a corner near an abandoned shed and settled there, shivering in the cold. That night was different. It was not only hunger or cold, it was the silence inside them. Even the children, who usually whispered stories to each other, said nothing. They lay curled together, staring into the dark. It was as if hope had finally slipped out of their small circle. The next morning, one of the younger children asked a question that pierced everyone's heart. In a quiet voice, almost like a confession, the child said, "Maybe the people are right. Maybe we don't belong anywhere." The words hung in the air. The parents froze. They had always tried to keep the children believing that things would get better. But now, even the little ones were beginning to doubt. It felt like their spirit was breaking, and that was worse than hunger or rejection. Hunger can be cured with food, but a broken spirit is harder to heal. For the first time, the father looked at his wife and admitted what they had both feared silently. "I don't know how much longer we can do this." His voice trembled not from weakness of the body, but from the heaviness of despair. It was a dangerous moment. Despair is like a shadow that grows longer when the light fades. If they gave in to it completely, the journey would end not because the road was too long, but because their hearts could no longer move forward. Days passed like this, silent, heavy, uncertain. They kept moving, but without the same hope. It was as if they were walking because they didn't know what else to do. Every step felt empty. And then came betrayal. the kind that cut deeper than rejection from strangers. A distant relative, whom they had trusted, promised to take them in. The family felt a spark of relief when they heard it. Finally, someone from their own bloodline was ready to help. They traveled with new energy, even singing softly to themselves as they walked, believing their wandering was about to end. But when they arrived, the truth was cruel. The relative welcomed them with polite words at first, but quickly grew cold. "You can't stay here," he said after only a few days. "People will talk. It will harm my reputation." He gave them a little food and a few coins, and then he sent them away. The betrayal crushed them. Strangers turning them away was painful, but to be abandoned by family, by someone who shared their blood, was almost unbearable. That night the children cried softly, not from hunger but from heartbreak, and the parents, though they held them close, had no words left to comfort them. It was their lowest point. The family began to wonder if the world had no place for them at all, if perhaps they were destined to remain wanderers until their last breath. They questioned everything, their past, their worth, even their faith that life could still change. And yet, something strange happened in that darkness. When they had nothing left, not even the comfort of belief, they discovered a small strength inside. It was not loud or bright, it was quiet like a single candle in a storm. But it was there. The parents realized that if the world had turned away, then the only world they could fully trust was the one within their family. They decided they would not let despair win. They would keep moving, not because they believed in some magical ending, but because they could not allow their children to grow up thinking surrender was the only option. So they rose again. Weak, tired, hearts broken, but still together. The children saw this. They noticed that even when their parents were empty, they kept walking. Even when tears filled their eyes, they still held the children's hands. And slowly that small flame of strength spread. The children too began to carry it. Their situation did not suddenly improve. They were still hungry, still rejected, still without a home. But the way they carried the struggle changed. They no longer walked hoping for others to open doors. They walked because they had each other, and that was reason enough to keep going. The world outside was cruel, but within their circle, they built a tiny shelter of love. It was fragile, but it was real. They sang quietly at night again, even if the songs were sad. They told stories of better days again, even if their voices cracked. And in doing so, they reminded themselves that they were still alive, still human, still capable of holding on. And while they did not yet know it, this decision, to keep walking even at rock bottom, was the turning point. Because sometimes, it is only when you reach the very bottom that you are ready to see a different kind of path. For now, though, they remained in the shadows of despair. The world around them continued to turn cold faces. Food was still scarce. Shelter was still uncertain, but deep inside a shift had taken place. They had fallen to the lowest point, but they had not been broken. And soon this hidden strength would guide them towards something unexpected, the embrace of the earth itself. After months of wandering, the family had grown used to the road. They had no choice but to keep moving, carrying their lives in worn bags and tired steps. By now, they expected rejection wherever they went. When people looked at them, they saw it coming. The same suspicious glances, the same whispers, the same cold silence. The family had learned not to hope too much. Hope, they knew, could hurt as much as hunger. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in shades of orange, they reached the edge of a small settlement. Unlike the other towns they had seen, this place was not filled with tall houses or crowded markets. Instead, it was surrounded by wide open fields, patches of green and land that seemed alive with work. Men and women bent low over the soil, their hands busy planting, watering, and harvesting. Children ran between the rows, their laughter carried by the wind. The family stopped for a moment. They had never seen such a place before. It was not wealth or grandeur that made it special. It was something else, something softer. The land looked cared for, and in return it gave back life. Hunger pushed them forward. They walked slowly toward the fields, unsure what kind of welcome they would find. The workers noticed them, of course, but instead of scowls or suspicious eyes, there was curiosity. One of the women stood up, wiped her forehead, and asked gently, "Are you travelers?" The family hesitated. They had been asked this before, and the answer usually brought distance, not kindness. But before they could reply, another voice spoke from the field. If you are hungry, come and sit. We have food, the family was stunned. Offers like this did not come often. They looked at each other, uncertain if it was safe to accept. But their empty stomachs made the decision for them. They followed the woman to a shaded spot where she handed them simple food, fresh bread, some vegetables, a jug of water. It was the first meal they had eaten without fear in a long time. The children ate with wide eyes, savoring every bite. The parents whispered thank yous, their voices heavy with gratitude. The workers watched them not with judgment but with quiet smiles. After they finished eating, the woman asked, "Do you know how to work the land?" The father nodded slowly. His hands had known soil since childhood. He had planted, watered, and harvested before life had turned harsh. "Yes," he said softly, almost afraid to believe where this question might lead. "Then stay for a while," she said. "There is always more work than hands here." The family exchanged glances. Could it be this simple? After all the closed doors, after all the harsh words, was someone finally opening a space for them? They began the very next morning. The work was hard, bending under the sun, pulling weeds, carrying water, but it was honest. And unlike before, no one treated them as outsiders. They were simply workers, side by side with others, hands in the same soil. The children, too, found joy here. They played with the other kids, running barefoot between the crops, laughing in a way they had not laughed for years. The sound of their laughter was like music to the parents' ears. It was proof that perhaps life was slowly changing. Days turned into weeks. The family was given a small hut near the fields, nothing grand, but enough to keep them warm and safe at night. For the first time in a long while, they did not wake up to uncertainty about where they would sleep. They had a roof, however simple, and that roof felt like a blessing. What surprised them most was how little anyone cared about their past. No one asked why they had left their old home or what had happened to them. Here it did not matter. What mattered was whether they were willing to work, whether they respected the earth, whether they shared what little they had. The land itself became a teacher. As they planted seeds and watched them grow, the family began to heal. Every sprout that pushed through the soil felt like a reminder that even after darkness, life can return. Every harvest showed them that patience and care could bring reward. The earth did not care about gossip or reputation. It cared only for effort and love. The children learned lessons too. They discovered how to water plants gently, so the soil would not wash away. They learned which crops needed shade and which thrived in full sun. They laughed when their hands turned muddy, and they proudly carried baskets of vegetables back to the hut. For them, the land became both playground and school. The parents felt something they had not felt in years: dignity. It was not wealth, but it was worth more than gold. Each day they returned from the fields tired but content. They no longer felt like burdens, no longer like wanderers begging for a place. They were part of something bigger, something living. And slowly a sense of community grew around them. The workers shared meals, exchanged stories, and celebrated small festivals together. The family was included without hesitation. For the first time since their exile, they were not the unwanted. They were simply people among people. One evening, as they sat by a small fire near their hut, the mother looked at her children and whispered, "The earth has accepted us when people would not." Her words carried truth. The soil they worked on did not ask about their past. It only asked for care, and in return it offered food, peace, and belonging. This realization settled deep in their hearts. Perhaps home was not a place built of stone walls and familiar streets. Perhaps home was wherever they were welcomed by the ground beneath their feet. Of course, life here was not perfect. The work was still exhausting, the hut was small, and some days were harder than others. But compared to the endless rejection of their wandering years, this life felt like a miracle. They had been banished by all. Yet here, among fields and open skies, they found arms that embraced them. Not human arms, but the arms of the earth itself. And little did they know this was only the beginning. Because as roots grew deeper in the soil, their own roots began to settle once more. Not in the old town that cast them out, but in new ground that promised them a future. The days in the field slowly turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The family, who had once lived with nothing but uncertainty, began to feel a rhythm return to their lives. Every morning they rose with the sun, stepped onto the soil, and worked with their hands. The land demanded effort, But it gave back more than food, it gave back meaning. At first, they thought this might be temporary, like all the other places they had passed through. But something felt different this time. Here, no one pushed them away. No one whispered behind their backs. No one asked about their past or judged them for the way they had been forced to wander. Instead, people saw their work, their honesty, and their willingness to contribute. That was all that mattered. The family began to grow roots not just in the soil but in their hearts. The children who had once carried sadness in their eyes now woke up with excitement. They rushed to the fields, eager to play, to learn, to run barefoot on the earth that no longer felt like a stranger. They learned the names of different plants, the best times to water them, and how to watch for signs of growth. Their laughter, once silenced by rejection, now filled the air again. The parents, too, found peace in the small things. They felt dignity in returning home each evening with baskets of vegetables or fruits, knowing they had earned their share. They felt joy when they saw their children smile without fear, and they felt strength when they looked at each other and realized they had survived everything together. It wasn't an easy life. The work was still heavy, and the hut they lived in was small. But for the first time in years, the family did not feel like outsiders. They belonged, not because anyone gave them wealth or power, but because the earth had accepted them. The soil did not care where they came from. The rain did not ask why they had been banished. The crops did not demand explanations. All that mattered was care, patience, and love. And in giving those, the family received something far greater than food. They received belonging. Over time, the small hut became more than just shelter. They decorated it with little things they found: flowers from the fields, stones polished smooth by rain, wooden carvings shaped by careful hands. It became a home not because of its size but because it held their love. Evenings were special. After long hours of work, they gathered outside, sitting together under the wide sky. Sometimes neighbors joined them. They shared stories, laughter, and simple meals cooked over fire. There was no grand celebration, no festival with lights or music, but there was warmth, and that warmth was enough. One night, as the stars stretched endlessly above them, the father said softly, "We thought we had lost everything. But maybe this is what we were meant to find. A place where we do not need to prove ourselves because the earth itself welcomes us." The mother nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We were banished by people," she said, "but not by the world. The ground beneath us never refused us. It gave us space when no one else would." The children listened, their young hearts absorbing these truths. They would grow up remembering not just the pain of rejection, but also the healing power of belonging. Seasons changed again. Spring brought blossoms, summer brought heat, autumn gave golden harvests, and winter tested their strength. But unlike the winters of their wandering years, they were no longer exposed to the bitter winds without shelter. The small hut, the fire, the community, and the food they grew, all of it carried them through. The family learned more each day. They became skilled at working with the land, not just surviving on it. The father taught the children how to prepare the soil so it would stay rich. The mother showed them how to save seeds for the next season. Together they planted not just crops but a future, and slowly they stopped calling themselves wanderers. They were no longer people without a place. They were caretakers of the soil, members of a community, part of something larger than themselves. The wounds of exile had not disappeared, but they had been softened by the touch of the earth and the kindness of simple people who valued effort over gossip. What they discovered was this: home is not always where you are born or where people say you belong. Sometimes home is the place where your hands, your heart, and your hope are accepted without question. For them, this place, these fields, this soil, became that home. Years later, when they looked back on their journey, they no longer remembered only the pain of rejection. They remembered how in their darkest moment, when every door closed, the ground itself opened. They remembered how the earth embraced them when no one else would. And they carried that lesson with them always, that even when people banish you, life still finds a way to offer a place of belonging. The family had been banished by all. But in the end, they were never truly alone. The earth itself had opened its arms, and in those arms they found not just survival, but roots, dignity, and peace.